According to the high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa, an AU-mandated body led by former South African President Thabo, the amount of money lost from the continent as illicit financial flows could be as high as 3 times that originally thought, with current estimates being over $60 billion.
Aid is now around 50 billion, sometimes a bit less, depending on how you count it. And just remittances from our diaspora is 60 billion. If we look into illicit financial flows, and the report will be presented, we are talking about roughly 50 billion that disappear in mispricing, capital flight, but also just illicit criminal activities.
Experts indicate that large corporate entities operating in Africa are major conduits for illicit funds, and in many cases are responsible for siphoning of cash that would otherwise be paid as tax.
At least 60% of these illicit outflows occur through the activities of commercial companies. It's the transnational companies that account for the bulk of the capital that is leaving the continent illegally.
The panel, though, was insistent that a variety of reasons were responsible for aggravating the problem, chief among them lack of international transparency, poor information sharing, and lack of proper audit capacity.
This capacity challenge is also, even when the problem has been identified correctly and people know what to do, the capacity to do what you know needs to be done also becomes a challenge.
These multinational companies extract resources from or sell their goods and services in Africa, but contribute little taxes because most of them benefit from tax treaties or agreements that allow them to remit profits and dividends without paying fair taxes in the countries in which their incomes are generated.
The Africa Union and the Economic Commission for Africa have both called for a review of the institutional framework to tame the vice, while reviewing laws and treaties which create loopholes for multinationals to exploit while remitting funds. The two organizations also suggest that information sharing across tax jurisdictions should be made a priority. Peter Kaba, CCTV.
To expand more on this topic, we're joined tonight by Henry Malumo, the Africa Advocacy Coordinator at ActionAid. It's a company that works to reduce poverty and injustice. Thank you for joining us tonight, Henry. There are those who insist that the hemorrhaging of capital out of the continent may not be as serious as some are saying. If you could put into perspective for us the challenge of illicit financial flows.
Well, clearly illicit flows are plundering the continent. Illicit flows are basically undermining the huge gains that Africa had made during the liberation struggle. Africa's forefathers fought for this continent's independence. That was political independence then. And at this particular time, our forefathers, our mothers that fought for that independence, secured that this continent should be economically free, should be economically independent. In terms of figures right now, if you compare what the panel has revealed, during the recent meeting in Abuja, that $60 billion is lost due to illicit flows every year, that is not half of what Africa receives in terms of aid. In fact, if you look at the ratio, Africa receives $1, and out of that, Africa takes out $10. So for every dollar that lands on this continent, $10 leaves a continent. So this is the money that should industrialize Africa. And when we are saying this is plundering Africa, it's because these are multinationals, big international companies, unfortunately supported by unfair tax agreements between Africa and rich nations. So it clearly shows that Africa's development has been undermined by the same people who on one hand, claim or have basically positioned themselves to support Africa's development. So what is that in terms of actual scenario on the ground? We are talking about Africa not being able to feed its own children, Africa not being able to provide quality health, quality education, because a lot of these monies go back 10 times the money that goes back to Europe, to America, to other countries, whether it's the East, the West, and the North. So Africa continues to lose these billions. And literally, it's a plunder, because instead of allowing a win-win situation between the investor and the source of these abundant natural resources, Africa is on the losing side.
Speaking of the conference in Abuja, a lack of capacity in auditing and capacity to operate on a global financial level were identified as factors that are exacerbating the problem of illicit flows. How can Africa grow its capacity to be able to police this problem?
Well, as ActionAid International, we've made submissions through the meeting in Mexico on global partnership, that the new partnership for Africa's development, our new partnership with EU, with America, should be one that facilitates enhancement of this capacity, should one that transfers the technology, the knowledge to African countries so that they themselves will be able to manage and to be able to reduce on the corruption. But above that, it's something that has to go beyond the continent, because this is happening at an international level. So you do need, international commitments, both by the G8 countries, by the African countries, and by the global partners, basically to agree to a new partnership that will facilitate the transfer of capacity, and so that the issue of corruption, to some extent, is actually reduced.
Speaking of the G8, their new alliance for food security to ease access for Western companies to enter and set up shop in many African countries is being said by some organizations that it actually poses a risk for Africa's food security. Do you agree with this, and why?
Oh yes, it does, because unfortunately Africa does have, its own program, the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, commonly known as CAADP. So when the new alliance comes in, it distorts the already existing program. China could also come in and have its own program. Other continents or other players could also come in and call for a similar program. So what we are saying is that rather than create so many initiatives on the continent, work within the African defined, the homegrown program. So unlike initiating other processes, Africans know what they want. If you look at the statistics today, Africa spends over $10 billion in food importation. Our main challenge in the agriculture sector are issues of technology, are issues of input. But then you see a scenario within the alliance that empowers companies in America, companies in Europe to come and invest in Africa. Well, that is not what Africa needs. Africa needs investment, public financing for agriculture that is invested, that is shaped, that is designed by our governments, who responsibly know where the needs are, and who uplift, uplift the smallholder farmers. And in this particular sense, we're talking about the women smallholder farmers who needed those resources, and not uplift American or European companies.
Okay, thank you so much for that. That's Henry Malumo, the African Advocacy Coordinator at ActionAid.